Hello again to everyone who has come to my channel. Today, I will finally talk about the manned missions under the Project Gemini. So, after just two quite unusual test flights of the Gemini 1 and Gemini 2 spacecraft, the manned part of this program kicked off. Records were set one after another. Over just 20 months, 10 launches were conducted. The total time spent by the spacecraft in orbit exceeded 41 days. The total spacewalk time exceeded 10 hours. Records for flight duration and orbital altitude were set. The first spacecraft dockings in history were also carried out. But let's go through everything in order and in more detail. So, on March 23, 1965, the Gemini 3 spacecraft with Virgil Grissom and John Young on board was launched into space. The mission lasted only 4 hours and 53 minutes, and during the flight, the first orbital maneuvering was performed. The spacecraft then successfully splashed down in the ocean. On June 3, 1965, the Gemini 4 spacecraft with James McDivitt and Edward White on board was launched. The mission lasted about 4 days, and during the flight, the first American spacewalk was performed. Let's focus on this flight in more detail. So, Edward White became the first American to perform a spacewalk. The spacewalk lasted 22 minutes, immediately breaking Alexei Leonov's record, and was almost entirely filmed. The quality of this footage was quite good, which was not the case for subsequent astronaut spacewalks. Let's watch this sequence. After standing in the cabin with the hatch open for a long time and securing the camera, White finally floated out of the cabin smoothly and without any jerks in a bed posture. In fact, he maintained this posture for the entire spacewalk. All subsequent astronauts also performed their spacewalks in exactly this posture. We will return to discussing this posture later. During his first spacewalk, White tested a maneuvering gun, informally known as the zip gun, intended to help him move in outer space. According to some experts, using this gun was inconvenient even on Earth. In vacuum of space, with the spacesuit and especially the gloves inflating due to internal pressure, using it was likely impossible. Indeed, throughout the entire spacewalk we don't see any evidence of this gun working. It was never used by anyone afterward and turned out to be completely unnecessary. By the way, regarding the gloves, during White's spacewalk, an interesting incident occurred. A glove suddenly flew out of the open hatch of the cabin at quite a high speed, hit the tether, and continued to rise upwards, disappearing into space beyond the frame. Another rather strange moment is the alternating views of Earth. At first, as we see, White is floating above a clear blue Earth. Then the camera angle changes slightly, and thick, dense cloud cover is immediately visible below him. At first glance, nothing special. It's understandable that clear areas over the Earth are replaced by zones with clouds. However, during this spacewalk, the alternation between cloudy and clear areas happens abruptly and several times with the change in camera angle. That is, White is above a blue Earth, then a slight editing cut or a change in camera angle, and dense cloud cover is beneath him. Another change in angle, blue Earth again. Change in angle, dense cloud cover. Why would this happen suddenly? Also, where does this slight change in angle come from? As we saw, White secured only one camera behind him, and its shadow is visible on the hatch cover. Leonov's spacewalk was filmed with 3 cameras, but they were mounted in different places. One was inside the airlock, that footage exists. Another was mounted on the spacecraft itself, that footage also exists. The third was mounted outside on the edge of the airlock, and we saw that footage too. Suppose there was no other place on Gemini, and they mounted 2 duplicate cameras to get roughly the same angle. Let's go with that. Now let's try to examine this spacewalk in detail. First, let's compare it with Leonov's free floating in space. As we see in this sequence, Leonov could freely rotate in all directions, move his arms and legs. So, what does this odd twisted pose of Edward White and all subsequent astronauts resemble? Here's what. It looks like an ordinary safety line, a cable on which he apparently was suspended, which immediately suggests the idea of studio filming. Accordingly, to imitate White's rotation, since he couldn't rotate on this line, the Gemini craft itself was rotated, or rather a mock-up of the spacecraft with a camera mounted on it, which was in turn mounted on a stand. This mock-up was rotated against the backdrop of a screen projecting a rotating Earth. Possibly, several takes were done on different days, hence the changing cloud cover and slight change in camera angle. Furthermore, to support the idea that these shots were filmed in a studio, there are several additional theories. The first one is suggested by special effects cameraman Leonid Konovalov, who has been closely studying the U.S. space missions from his purely cameraman's perspective. He suggested that White's spacewalk was filmed and then played back in reverse. In other words, White was initially suspended on a tether and did not float out of the spacecraft but descended into it. Hence, his smooth exit from the cabin without any jerks. This theory also explains the glove's movement. Naturally, it did not pop out of the cabin but was simply thrown in from above. This explains both its speed and the unchanged trajectory even after colliding with the tether. By the way, where would it come from, in the real spacecraft? Why wasn't it secured? Why didn't any other unsecured objects float out into space? And so on.
With his left hand, he grabs the free end of the strap. He transfers the zip gun from his right hand and starts shaking the tether. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then he returns the zip gun to his right hand. The free end of the strap keeps dangling. The set, which was rotating around its axis, starts slowing down. A jolt, a hit, an edit, a cut of 15 frames. The set stops and starts gradually turning in the opposite direction. Meanwhile, the astronaut is stuck to the nose of the capsule. He tries to get unstuck and push away from it. Finally, he manages to do so. He slowly moves away from the nose of the capsule, keeps manipulating the zip gun and camera, as if taking photos. And at 6:20, he starts to move out of the frame and eventually disappears from view.
The second theory supporting the idea of studio filming is somewhat more complex. Its proponents believe the shots were filmed in a wind tunnel, and they present the following arguments to support this. Certain straps, cords, and various small fastening elements of the spacesuit either stand upright, as in the case of Buzz Aldrin's spacewalk where some straps on his shoulders were sticking up, or, as in White's case, are all aligned in one plane and direction, which is only possible in an airstream. Again, compare this with the footage of contemporary spacewalks on the ISS, where nothing like this is observed. All objects in zero gravity, left to themselves, are arranged in a completely chaotic manner. After completing his spacewalk, White returned to the spacecraft. The spacecraft then spent some more time in orbit. As I said, the mission lasted about 4 days, and then started re-entry. The documentary 4 Days of Gemini tells its story and shows the next footage.
Gemini 4 would fly the same type of re-entry as Gemini 2, an earlier unmanned flight. We will illustrate the re-entry of McDivitt with film from that flight. This is an onboard camera, Gemini 2, looking through the spacecraft window. The film is reproduced at 4 times normal speed.
Feeling great. How about you?
Gemini 4, Houston, Capcom. Roger, you started your rolling reentry? Roger. Your weather is still very good, Jim.
Communications with the ground break off, but the onboard tape recorder is running. We listen to two men returning to Earth after 4 days in space.
Look at us. We're making it on fire, too. Yeah, we're making it, putting our ionization layer out. They're not reading us anymore now, probably. There goes Florida. Is that Florida? I believe it is. See it on your side? Yeah. They're red hot, you know. Sit back and relax. We ain't gonna do much about it from here out. No. Get ready for the cheeks, man. I think we got now about 5 feet. What would you say, Phil? It's only going up in the way. You know, it's kind of nice to have some cheeks out again. Yeah, it is. It's making me dizzy going around in circles. Look at the paint coming out my window. Roger, Kickabow. We're just about ready to put the parachute up. Stand by.
Several questions immediately arise here. Why are scenes from the Gemini 2 mission, shot by automatic camera, shown in the documentary about the Gemini 4 mission? Well, let's assume that the Gemini 4 astronauts, for some reason, couldn't film their re-entry, or it didn't turn out well. But then it is stated that the re-entry trajectory of Gemini 2 was the same as that of Gemini 4. However, as we remember from the previous episode, I mentioned that Gemini 2 did not reach orbit. It was a suborbital test flight to test the heat shield. Consequently, Gemini 2 simply could not have had the same re-entry trajectory as Gemini 4. It turns out that the Americans, when making documentaries about the missions of their own spacecraft, either didn't know everything about these flights or couldn't coordinate properly. Next, in this sequence, we see some flame bursting out of the nose of the Gemini spacecraft. Presumably, this was supposed to show the operation of the retrorocket system. However, as we remember from cutaways and diagrams, this system was mounted at the back, behind the heat shield, and it was impossible to see its operation from the window. The maneuvering thrusters were located in the nose of the spacecraft. Their nozzles were directed sideways, but no flames were coming out of them. In the front part, there were only the covers of the parachute compartment, and no engines were there. Then we see the atmospheric re-entry, the deployment of the drogue and main parachutes, and a voiceover commenting on how beautiful the parachute is. By the way, in no other Gemini documentary do we see the deployment of parachutes at all. In one of the films, there is a scene of atmospheric re-entry. There's also flames coming out of the nose, supposedly pieces of the heat shield flying past the window, and everything ends in complete darkness. So, the Gemini 4 mission successfully ended with splashing down in the ocean. On August 21st of the same year, 1965, the Gemini 5 spacecraft with Gordon Cooper and Charles Conrad on board was launched. This mission lasted almost 8 days, and after a successful splashdown in the ocean, the recovered astronauts were subjected to a medical examination on the aircraft carrier. The fresh and tanned astronauts, it's not very clear where they got tanned after 8 days in space, had their hearts examined, their ears checked, and that seemed to be the end of the medical examination. Again, this was the only medical examination captured on film during all the Gemini flights. We won't see doctors near the astronauts either before or, more importantly, after their landing. Finally, on December 4th of the same year, 1965, the Gemini 7 spacecraft with James Lovell and Frank Borman in the leading roles was launched into space. It's probably more accurate to say, in the leading roles, indeed. Later, I will explain why. The mission lasted a full 14 days, and during this flight, the first rendezvous of spacecraft in orbit was achieved. Because shortly after, on December 15 of the same year, the Gemini 6 spacecraft with Walter Schirra and Tom Stafford on board was launched. This spacecraft stayed in orbit for about a day, and during 3 orbits, the spacecraft rendezvoused and separated at distances ranging from 30 meters to 30 centimeters. After that, Gemini 6 successfully splashed down in the ocean. The Gemini 7 spacecraft splashed down on December 18. The astronauts were able to get out of the Gemini 7 capsule quite energetically on their own and were lifted into the helicopter using the sling. From there, they descended the ladder to the deck of the aircraft carrier, mimicking slightly heavy legs. Yes, mimicking slightly heavy legs. This slight heaviness was the only problem the astronauts faced after the 14-day mission, as commented by the flight surgeon overseeing this mission. Really? Is that the only issue they encountered? Let's compare this with the flights of our Soyuz 7 and Soyuz 9 spacecraft. Soyuz 7, with cosmonauts Gorbatko, Filipchenko, and Volkov, flew in October 1969, spending 5 days in orbit in the more spacious Soyuz spacecraft, where the cosmonauts could stretch out. However, after landing, they barely managed to get out of the re-entry module, feeling the immense weight of Earth's gravity, which they had grown unaccustomed to, and it took them a couple of weeks to fully recover. The crew of Soyuz 9, Sevastyanov and Nikolaev, spent 18 days in low Earth orbit, just 4 days more than Lovell and Borman. They were pulled out of the re-entry module with great difficulty. They couldn't even sit up. They were loaded onto stretchers and carried to the helicopter. Nikolaev was in a pre-heart attack condition, and while the medics were fighting for his life, Sevastyanov crawled to him on all fours because he couldn't sit or stand. In the following year, Nikolaev had 2 heart attacks and was grounded and discharged from the cosmonaut corps, never flying to space again. Sevastyanov lay flat for a week, barely able to move, and only after that week did he slowly start to learn to walk again. Let's look at modern landings of cosmonauts after their stay on the Large Orbital Station Mir or the ISS, which are equipped with treadmills and other exercise equipment. Cosmonauts wear compression garments and are required to do at least 2 hours of physical exercises daily. It was after the Soyuz 9 mission that they came to realize the need for this, to prevent muscle atrophy and calcium depletion from the bones. And what do we see? Astronauts and cosmonauts returning from space after spending a week or 2 there, are seated in chairs, surrounded by a crowd of doctors, and despite their smiles, their faces show immense fatigue. They can barely move their tongues, and walking is out of the question. They are carefully loaded into helicopters while still in these chairs. Meanwhile, the brave American guys only experience slightly heavy legs. With our current understanding of how people return from real space, this looks very funny and naive. By the way, what were they wearing during this flight? If they were in spacesuits, then the astronauts' spacesuits are similar to modern chemical protective gear, meaning they are impermeable to water and air, and spending 2 weeks in them would be quite a torture. The astronauts would have suffered from severe dehydration due to heavy sweating, and, as I mentioned, they were rationed to about a cup of water per day. Next, recalling my favorite topic of toilets, the Gemini spacecraft did not have any, and the astronauts flew in something akin to diapers. How did they change them while in spacesuits, if in the spacecraft it was impossible to even slightly rise, let alone stand up? Regarding the spacesuits, in one of the films, There's a scene where an astronaut talks to mission control and mentions that spacesuits can be removed during the flight. However, the conversation ends there, and we never find out if any Gemini crew flew without spacesuits. Despite spending a total of 41 days in orbit, there are very few photos taken inside the Gemini spacecraft. There is a photo of Aldrin sitting in a spacesuit looking out the window, and another photo taken from the cabin towards the Earth. I will return to that later. And that's about it. The list of photos taken inside the Gemini spacecraft ends here. This was such a strange mission with real American heroes, hot shots, who endured 2 weeks in these conditions. By the way, according to the recollections of one of the astronauts, I don't remember who exactly, and it's not that important. He held out for the first 10 days without a bowel movement, and only on the 10th day did he accomplish this feat.
The question arises, did his partner also hold out for 10 days, or did he accomplish this feat earlier? If he did it earlier, what was the point of the first astronaut holding out?
I can't even imagine the smell in that cabin, how these brave people managed to endure it. Nevertheless, according to the American version, that's exactly what happened.
On March 16, 1966, the Gemini 8 spacecraft with Neil Armstrong and David Scott on board was launched into orbit.
During this mission, the first orbital docking with the Agena target vehicle was carried out. Essentially, the Agena was a booster stage used for launching artificial Earth satellites. In the Project Gemini, it was mounted on an Atlas rocket as a second stage and used in space as a docking target. However, here we encounter another oops, because, as we remember from photos and diagrams of the Gemini spacecraft, it did not have anything resembling a docking port, docking rods, clamps, or any other devices that could attach one spacecraft to another.
The docking port on the Agena is shown even less clearly on diagrams, or rather, practically not shown. In photographs, it looks more like a nozzle.
Additionally, all the dockings with the Agena occur in some kind of semi-darkness, which is strange.
I can recommend to viewers the modern documentary, Journey to the ISS, the Soyuz Operations Explained series.
It clearly states that modern spacecraft dockings with the ISS are planned so that the station is well lit, the sun is not blinding, but the spacecraft can maneuver around the well-lit station and select the most suitable docking port. Here, however, the first dockings in history happen almost entirely in darkness, where it is impossible to discern any details of the Agena's docking port. So, after docking and flying for a while in this configuration, the undocking process was carried out, causing the Gemini spacecraft to spin. The rotation reached 1 revolution per second, and Armstrong had to switch to manual control, experiencing 3.5 G forces. He managed to stabilize the spacecraft somewhat, but it was decided to abort the mission.
The spacecraft deorbited and successfully splashed down, but the mission lasted only about 10 hours. Next, on June 3, 1966, the Gemini 9 spacecraft was launched from Cape Canaveral with Tom Stafford and Eugene Cernan on board.
The mission lasted about 3 days. The first mission objective was to dock with an Agena target vehicle, but this time the launch shroud failed to open properly and did not completely separate from the Agena, rendering its docking port inaccessible.
Therefore, only a rendezvous was performed.
Also, during this flight, Eugene Cernan conducted a spacewalk and was supposed to test the astronaut maneuvering unit attached to the back of the spacecraft. However, the tests did not go well, and Cernan's spacewalk was not filmed either. Despite all these unsuccessful experiments, the spacecraft successfully splashed down in the ocean.
Next, on July 18, 1966,
the Gemini 10 spacecraft was launched with John Young and Michael Collins on board. The mission also lasted about 3 days. During this flight, 2 dockings were performed. First, the spacecraft docked with Agena 8, and Michael Collins conducted a spacewalk to retrieve a sample from the Agena, which appeared to be a micrometeorite collector. He brought it into the spacecraft, after which the Agena's engines were fired to boost the spacecraft to a higher orbit. There, after undocking from Agena 8, it docked with Agena 10, which was in that orbit. Collins again conducted a spacewalk and transferred the micrometeorite collector to Agena 10. None of the 3 spacewalks Collins performed during this mission were filmed either. After some time, the spacecraft undocked and successfully splashed down in the ocean. On September 12, 1966, the Gemini 11 spacecraft was launched with Charles Conrad and Richard Gordon on board. The mission also lasted about 3 days, and on the first orbit, the spacecraft docked with Agena 11. A total of 4 dockings and undockings were performed during the flight so that each crew member could practice the maneuver twice. After that, Gemini 11 used the rocket on its Agena target vehicle to raise its apogee to a record high of 1,372 kilometers. As proof, the astronauts took this photograph. The steep curvature of the Earth's circumference was supposed to serve as evidence of the altitude. However, researchers of American missions, such as Alexander Popov and some other specialists, believe that this is not the Earth's circumference but merely the edge of the window. In other words, the photograph was taken from deep inside the Gemini cabin, and the Earth is seen from usual orbit through the window. Furthermore, there are several theories regarding the origin of this image. Some believe it could have been taken from a satellite, while others think it could have been taken from a manned spacecraft, if the Americans were indeed there, by cleverly framing the window. Alternatively, it might have been taken in a studio, again from inside the cabin. In front of the cabin could have been either a screen with the Earth projected onto it or simply a photograph. Incidentally, the final clue is the absence of a thin blue line of the atmosphere around the Earth. The Earth is sharply outlined against the black background of space or the window. After reaching this high orbit, the spacecraft undocked from the Agena, connecting to it with a tether beforehand. As the spacecraft moved away from the Agena, the tether stretched, and the spacecraft started rotating at a rate of about 40 degrees per minute. This was an attempt to create a minimal amount of artificial gravity. As I mentioned, a similar experiment was planned in the Soviet Voskhod program. According to the astronauts' recollections, the tether was then detached and wrapped around Agena 11 like a Christmas lights. After this, the exit hatch was opened, and some trash and no longer needed spacewalk tools were thrown overboard. This is pure Jules Verne, reminiscent of his novel From the Earth to the Moon, where travelers quickly opened and closed the window to throw out trash. Not only was trash thrown out, but also the spacewalk tools were discarded for some reason. Why did they suddenly become unnecessary and so bothersome? They could have been useful for the next mission. It's unclear. Generally, what is now considered an emergency or a serious incident, which is avoided by all means, i.e., the depressurization of the spacecraft, was absolutely routine in the Gemini missions. Besides planned spacewalks, it was also used for throwing out trash. No big deal. Just vent oxygen, open the hatch, throw out the trash, close the hatch, refill the cabin with oxygen, no problems. After this, Gemini 11 also successfully splashed down in the ocean. And finally, on November 11, 1966, the Gemini 12 spacecraft launched with Buzz Aldrin and James Lovell on board. The mission lasted about 4 days. There was also a docking with Agena 12, and the experiment with the tether and the creation of artificial gravity was repeated. Aldrin performed 3 spacewalks, of which about 2 minutes or less were filmed and in much worse quality. Aldrin also hovered above the spacecraft in a cramped pose in an inflated spacesuit. And the footage of Aldrin's spacewalk suddenly cuts to footage of training in a pool, accompanied by text like this. An underwater simulation pool was built to practice spacewalk skills, where the astronauts trained. Here are Aldrin and Lovell training. Look at their pool training. It was the same in space. After the completion of this mission, Gemini 12 also successfully returned to Earth. The Gemini program was then closed because, according to designers, engineers, and organizers, all the necessary information had been obtained and all the experience needed for lunar missions had been accumulated. By the way, in all the Gemini documentaries, most of the footage is dedicated to beautiful Hawaiian nights, concerned faces in the Mission Control Center, close-ups of ashtrays overflowing with cigarette butts symbolizing tension, shots of astronauts boarding the spacecraft, and even several commercials. There are very few shots directly related to the flights themselves, such as launches or any filming in space, and they are very uninformative. This is what the Project Gemini was like. Paraphrasing the words of an engineer about the accumulated experience, I would say that experience in falsification was gained. It was a dress rehearsal for the lunar missions. They gauged public opinion, realized that everything went smoothly, the public was taken for a ride, and everyone was happy. They could then put the final exclamation mark in the form of simulated landings on the moon. That's all for today. Goodbye. See you soon.